Well, thank you so much, Professor Mantler. This was an amazing conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and speak with me today.
So yeah, I'm Gordon Mantler. I've been at GW for more than 11 years. I came in my first semester was in January 2014. I had taught at Duke before that, which is where my had my PhD in history, and where I also taught in the Thompson Writing program for several years, which in many ways is how I kind of got interested in teaching in a writing program in the first place. I've taught a number of different courses through the university writing, themes, freedom struggles more generally. So not just civil rights, but the Chicano movement, the anti-war movement, women's second liberation movement, things like that. I taught a film class for several years. And then I've been teaching up until my sabbatical memorialization and museum exhibit course. So again, thinking about how we narrate the past through these alternative spaces and then writing about it. So instead of, traditional textbooks, looking at how a memorial will tell a particular kind of story about an individual or a war or some kind of social movement. But, there's often silences, right? In some ways, the silences are louder than what's being said. And then the same with museum exhibits, although they're a little different, of course, and there's a lot more opportunity for detail and for more nuance than a memorial. I still think museum exhibits are interesting spaces to kind of explore because their goal is a little bit different in some ways than, say, an academic history book like the kinds that I've written, or the ones I assign and things like that. So, the class that I'm about to teach this fall is a new one, and I'm still developing it, but it's about thinking about DC social movement histories, really from the abolitionist movement that became really popular or started gaining popularity in the 1840s and 1850s before the Civil War in Washington, all the way through the Home Rule movement and really the statehood movement, which is what it's called now. But Home Rule in meaning some level of democracy where DC residents actually can vote for their elected officials, which for nearly 100 years they weren't able to. So really from the late 1870s to the early 1970s, everybody was appointed. And so if you lived in DC, in the nation's capital of the most influential and one of the most important democracies in history, you didn't actually have a democracy in the capital, which is kind of a crazy thing to think about. So we're going to explore that, write about it, read about it, and so that's the plan for the fall. So.
All right, well, thank you so much. I mean, obviously, a lot of your work revolves around history, and as you mentioned, that's what you got your PhD in. And that kind of leads me to my last little icebreaker for this portion of the interview. I'm curious, if you weren't teaching or even writing about history, what do you think you would be doing instead?
Hmm. Well, I was a journalist for many years, and so I like that work. I did some reporting, but I did a lot of editing, and so I still yeah, like working with the language and crafting stories, synthesizing large amounts of information. Um, I still think that humans do a better job of that than artificial intelligence. And so, but whether or not those jobs will exist in 5 or 10 years, I'm not sure. But that was something I really enjoyed doing in many ways. I was called in a sense to write history. I mean, I was in a newsroom for about 8 years, but I really found like I wanted to tell these stories in more in-depth ways. I actually wanted to write books if I could, and so which are, of course, long-term projects that I did not have the opportunity to do in the newsroom. So, I mean, that might be one thing that I would do if I had the opportunity again. And this was not, I couldn't be an historian because this is what I like doing most, and teaching writing and history. And so, but one of my advisors used to say that, oh, historians are just slow journalists. Instead of deadlines every day, we have deadlines every 5 to 10 years. But which is a little, you know, he said it in jest, and yet there's some truth to that in terms of the skill sets that I work with in both fields. So yeah.
Thank you. It's so cool that you were a journalist before this. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think that leads me into my next question about, writing books and writing about history. You've written a lot about protest, inequality, and democratic participation. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what sparked your interest in movements like the Poor People's Campaign and multiracial activism.
Yeah, great question. I mean, so part of it comes out of the newsroom experience that I had. I mean, I felt like many times we would scratch the surface, but that was about it in terms of coverage of some pretty complicated, nuanced events. So, for instance, when I lived in Florida, in the St. Petersburg, Tampa area, in around the turn of the century, so 98, 99, 2000. Um, there was a fight over school desegregation in the county that St. Petersburg is in, called Pinellas County. And what I didn't totally understand was why there were there were two sets of parents that were challenging the desegregation order that really had, for 30 years, ordered the school district to desegregate in a particular way, where all schools pretty much had to be anywhere from 50% to 70% white, but no more. And then African Americans would be something like, 10 to 25% of every school. And then there was also Latinos and some other groups that were moving into the area that also changed those numbers. But what I didn't understand fully was why there was because I think I grew up thinking, oh, well, integration is a good thing. This is having integrated, diverse classrooms is what we want in society. So we know each other better, and that we learn from each other, and that we are, stronger together, than separated. And so, as a society and democracy. And so those were but you had both black and white parents that were challenging the desegregation order and wanting to get rid of it, which really allowed me to kind of pursue uh, looking at desegregation more generally in the schools in Pinellas, and how it came about, and really that desegregation was done on the backs of black children. They're the ones that were forced to be bused. They're the ones whose schools were closed. They're the ones whose teachers and principals and coaches were either demoted or fired. Their traditions, their mascots, all the things that they had become very proud of in a segregated system, were either marginalized or eliminated. And that's not really the way that we're taught civil rights in the schools. And it wasn't the way that I had been taught it, in the 80s. And so, as a white suburban kid. And so that really sparked my interest in understanding this particular movement better. And then when I moved to Durham, North Carolina, where Duke is and where I, pursued my PhD, I was again trying to make better sense of white and African American response to Latino migration in North Carolina and throughout the South, and trying and kind of an opposition, right? Saying that, well, these are spaces that were I'm not going to just welcome you in. We're now fighting over, different spaces, whether it's public schools or parks or resources or what have you. Um, and I was trying to make a better sense of that kind of reality that was going on in the first decade of the 21st century. And so, but I wanted to look at what it again. thinking that my civil rights education was pretty inadequate and pretty poor, I started looking at, well, where are there moments where there are Mexican Americans, Latinos, African Americans, whites working together, even if it's selectively, right? Maybe working on this one issue, but not these other issues, and trying to make sense of how coalition building happened, the limits to it, what were the barriers that got in the way of building coalition? Because to me, it seemed like a really important to understand to make the 21st century United States a better, more workable place, right? And to enhance the democracy where everybody feels like they have a seat at the table. I often talk about now, especially after doing this for 20 years, and I'm not the first to say this, but that really the civil rights movement and the coalition that elected Harold Washington as the first Black mayor of Chicago, the topic of my second book, it was really about opening up the city, opening up the nation to everybody, right? Where everybody feels like they belong, everybody feels like they have and their kids doing better than they did, but also just having a say in the democracy and ideal of a more perfect union. So that's kind of a very long-winded way of explaining how I got to where I did, but a lot of it is rooted in feeling like the history that I was taught in the 80s and early 90s and in high school and middle school, high school and college, and then spilling into the newsroom, and my understanding there was just inadequate. And so that's why I ended up going back and pursuing history and these particular themes.
Thank you so much. And not a long-winded answer at all. I think it provides a lot of context to the work that you do and the work that I want to talk about today. So I really appreciate that.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to go into The Multiracial Promise, which is a book that you authored. And you explore specifically how multiracial coalitions shaped Chicago politics and led to the election of Harold Washington as the first Black mayor of Chicago.
Mhm.
And so I was curious about what drew you to that specific time period and city, from the late 1960s to like the 1990s. And maybe if you could touch on a little bit about why looking into how the influence of multiracial coalitions have really kind of led to important advancements in history, why maybe that still matters today and why that's an important topic of conversation.
Mhm. Yeah, so the second book, in some ways, it's not a sequel to my first book, The Power to the Poor, but it did some of the seeds of that second book came out of the research process and the writing process of the first book. I ended up spending a good bit of time thinking about Chicago and the civil rights struggle in Chicago, in part because in the first book, the heart of it is the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, the last campaign that Dr. King was working on when he was assassinated. But to understand the Poor People's Campaign, you really have to trace back some of the efforts by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. King's organization, to previous campaigns, including the Chicago Freedom Movement in 1966, so a couple years before. Because some of the same people who are active in the Chicago movement then go on to Washington and are part of the Poor People's Campaign as well. And some of the lessons that the SCLC draws from the Chicago Freedom Movement, they try to apply some pretty unevenly, but try to apply to the Poor People's Campaign 2 years later. So I found myself in Chicago. Chicago is also this really interesting city in that there are a lot of attempts at multiracial work in different ways, both within unions, but also outside of unions, and at the kind of the neighborhood level, there are kind of what somebody might call youth gangs or but really youth groups who find common cause, oftentimes um, frustration with the police, kind of pushing around young working class men of all colors. And so Chicago is this really interesting um, I don't know, window into multiracial work, I think, around the country. Now you could also look, there's lots of interesting multiracial scholarship and looks at this kind of activism in the West, in particular, where you have a naturally a more, it seems like a more multiracial coalitions in California and Texas and other parts of the West where you just it's not quite as black and white as sometimes we think the East is, although that's always been oversimplified. But so uh, yeah, I was really interested in the legacies of the Poor People's Campaign as well. And one of the things I came across when I was in the archives in Chicago was uh, a guy named Al Raby, who was the campaign manager, the second campaign manager for Harold Washington in 1983. And he goes back 20 years in his activism to the early 60s. He actually was one of the people that invited Dr. King to Chicago in 1965 and 66. Um, and Raby writes an essay during the Harold Washington campaign in 83. It's never published as far as I can tell, but it's sitting in the archives, and it talks about the meaning of the Harold Washington campaign. Um, and in it, he directly draws a parallel between the Poor People's Campaign and the Harold Washington campaign that happens 15 years later, uh, primarily because of the multiracial sort of quality of it, right? So this is not just African Americans and whites, but this is also includes Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, trying to create this kind of rainbow coalition of folks, and that's what King's vision was in the late 60s. And he wasn't the only one. Fred Hampton, the Black Panther, also had a similar kind of vision. Cesar Chavez at times works with African Americans in California. There are a number of different moments where you see some of these efforts. But um, you know, in many ways, after the height of the kind of protests and rallies of the late 60s and early 70s, more and more um, African Americans kind of turn toward, and this makes sense because the Voting Rights Act now has had, was several in the past, have turned toward electoral politics as perhaps the best venue or best vehicle to political empowerment, and never abandoning protests, but seeing more opportunities to get inside the halls of power and make a real difference as mayors, as members of Congress, as senators, as poverty agency chiefs, all these, members of council. And so you start seeing what I would argue is kind of uh, a greater focus on formal electoral politics in the 70s and early 80s, where African Americans make real strides, usually based upon the social movements that came before it that made it possible to then get elected and wield real power. But it also, I think the thing that what we see and one of the arguments of the book is that these movements make it possible to elect a Harold Washington, who's quite a progressive figure, and tries to govern from a progressive position. But all the barriers and limitations to that, to really bring about change, whether it's deindustrialization or a pretty hostile federal government under Ronald Reagan, or even just the nature of the coalition itself. Because coalitions are a bunch of people who have some things in common and other things that they don't have in common. And especially with an electoral victory, the first step and the easiest one in many ways is electing the person and getting past that election. But then governing is much, much more difficult. And that's not that's not rocket science, but I feel like we need to be reminded of that time and time again that the real work is the policy making and keeping the coalition together and building new relationships and to actually bring about change in policy. So, yeah, I have some connections to Chicago as well, and so it's one of my favorite cities. But I really did see kind of in the archive and from the first book, kind of these connections in Chicago that I thought were going to be really productive to pursue. So that's what I did, and I just found myself really um, uh, loving the Harold Washington story, even though I wanted to, in many ways, tell the story of the movements that made that possible, and not just write a biography, which I don't, it's not a biography. It's something a little bit different than that. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really a fascinating piece of history, and really interesting how these people came together to kind of move forward. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that promise, as you phrase it in the title of the book, um, kind of continues to shape policies and politics and activism today.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually think and it's also part of the question I didn't fully answer from before about how this applies today. I mean, um, you know, bottom line is coalition is difficult. Building coalitions, maintaining coalitions, um, is hard work because it really is based in relationship building and trust. Uh, and so when you have relationships that perhaps they're somewhat superficial because they're around one electoral figure that you all can kind of rally behind because the alternative is much, much worse, whether it was then or now. I think it's that ends up kind of foreshadowing that, okay, you need to actually build real bonds with each other, or the coalition will probably not stay together. I also argue in different moments that coalitions are inevitably fleeting to a certain extent. And that just because they're not durable and last for a generation or even past a few elections doesn't necessarily mean that they're a failure. It just means that the coalition came together, for a particular moment to meet a particular historical moment. And so uh, I think that's a little less satisfying because I think we would prefer that these coalitions come together and stay together to make real change or bring about whatever that change, whatever change or solution folks want. But again, as I alluded to before, the coalitions are often inherently contradictory. So for Harold Washington's coalition, for instance, it was significant African American population in many ways had never voted in the numbers that they had in before or since 1983, that primary and general election. You didn't have as many African Americans voting either. Um, not even for Barack Obama, right? Which I think is striking, right? It was this local election with the first, a real chance for the first black mayor of Chicago, which some people would say is the second best political position in the country behind president, but I think a really challenging position too, in many ways. So I don't know if it's as sought after as it once was, but um, they so you had significant black population, enough whites that support him, but only about 12%. Significant Latino population. The Latino population split between mostly Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cuban Americans at that time, at least. And they voted in different ways. Cuban Americans tend to be more conservative. Puerto Ricans tend to be the most Democratic, largely Democratic. And so, uh, but then you also had what we would call good government folks who wanted less corruption, less nepotism, less pay for play kinds of policies in Chicago politics. Again, the argument is that um, everybody should have a fair, shake. Everybody should have their voice heard, have a seat at the table in a sense. It shouldn't be the wealthiest or the most connected who are able to get their sidewalk fixed or their garbage cans, replaced or the potholes on their street filled in or the government jobs that are inevitable and that are doled out, at the beginning of each administration. That it should be much more equitable, and maybe more efficient too, right? So less government waste in general. But what you found is that the folks who wanted good government efficiency of all races often were in conflict with those who are like, oh, finally, black mayor's in the mayor's office. Now we can get all the jobs and all the contracts that all the white mayors before us had, right? And so the same kind of spoils system or patronage system that existed was of interest to at least, to a significant number of people. It's like, great, well, now the police will be less violent toward us, and I'll have a job in city government. And it didn't fully work out that way, in part because of the economy, but also because Harold didn't actually did believe in many ways with cleaning up city government and making it more efficient. In part because he had to to meet a budget deficit, but also because that's what he believed. He had been part of the Democratic machine, which was the machine that said, if you vote for me, then I'll make sure your cousin and your brother is taken care of, that kind of thing. But, by age 60, when he was in running for mayor the second time in 83, he was much more interested in a government that was transparent and fair and open as best it could be. Other things I would say is that just because you have, a black mayor who then nominates and appoints a black police superintendent, a black head of the Board of Health, a black member, chair of the Public Housing Authority, the Chicago Housing Authority, doesn't make those inevitably or inherently dysfunctional institutions functional all of a sudden, right? It takes a long time to change these kinds of spaces because there's a lot of um, entrenched people and ways of doing things that are hard uh, uh, to fix overnight. And so what you find is that um, a level of disappointment with Harold because he's not able to make some of the changes as rapidly as people want him to because the just institutional inertia is really hard to sometimes fight, especially in government, but also in organizations, whether it's GW or or the federal government or somewhere else, right? So or some other corporation. But this is all to say that it's coalition is absolutely important. Building relationships is important. Understanding where each other is coming from, and sometimes agreeing to disagree about particular issues to reach a common cause is important to do. But that it constantly requires work, right? So just because you've elected somebody doesn't mean you can sit on your laurels now. You have to continue to do that work and keep that person accountable. And the movements that elected Harold, for instance, or elected Barack Obama in 2008, for instance, because I feel like there's some parallels there, need to stay engaged, right? Because they need the members, the people that are been elected actually need those movements to back them up as well, right? So it's not a one-way street; it's both ways. So like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to try to change healthcare, but I need you to show up, which I think folks did for the most part. But and I think the same would go for some of the reforms that Washington Mayor Washington tries to put in place, but not all. And I think that that's where you see the most success is when the movements and the activists and those in the neighborhood stayed engaged. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe how you help students kind of make those kinds of connections in their own writing, kind of talk about history in a way that still feels very present and current and relevant.
Yeah. Um, I mean, one, of course, I write about history the last 60, 70 years. So I have been able to use oral histories as part of my research, right? So I'm able to talk with those historical actors, um, 30, 40, 50 years later, um, about their experiences. And so I think that's one thing that makes it seem contemporary or relevant. And I also think that many of the issues that they were fighting over in the 50s, 60s, and 70s we're still fighting over in many ways, and particularly now, but really over the last really since I've been an historian, it's striking how we continue to um, focus on the same issues because they've never really been resolved. This is an aside, but I take my students to the African American History Museum or African American Museum of History and Culture on the Mall each semester as part of the public history class that I taught. And we go to this one room that's dedicated to Mary McLeod Bethune, who was a great civil rights activist and educator and aide and advisor to President Franklin Roosevelt. And she was part of the National Civil Rights Organization of Black women that would, put out demands. And if I remember right, the document that they have on display in the museum is a list of their top 12 demands. And I asked my students, so look at this list and tell what strikes you? And sometimes they need a little bit more prodding than that, but uh, what we conclude is that all the issues are the same thing. And nothing has really changed, right? Social Security is is maybe higher on the list than some of the than you might expect because Social Security at that time in the early 50s did not apply to many African Americans based on the professions that they and the work that they did as domestics and in agriculture. Social Security has been expanded in many in the 50s and 60s, but at the time, not everybody paid into it or had the benefits of it. But um, so, I mean, I think that the movements that I look at and are fighting over many of the same things that we care about today, right? So whether it's immigration or the language might be a little bit different, right? We didn't necessarily use the language of living wage then, but they were talking about good jobs, being able to take care of their family, educational opportunity, the environment. Again, they didn't talk about reproductive rights necessarily the same way that we do now, but it was just access to healthcare more generally. And so, um, but so for another thing I think, and one of the reasons why I teach about, write about social movements and teach it in different ways, whether it's through memorialization or through film or through this new class that I'm going to teach in the fall, um, is that I try to make it clear to students that anybody can be an historical actor. Um, and, many people that we talk about today didn't necessarily know that they were going to be talked about and written about 50, 100, 150 years later. I mean, some people might have. It's like if you run for president, I guess you're looking for headline, you're looking for some level of fame. But a lot of movement activists are just looking to make a difference. They get so annoyed, so irritated, so pissed off about some circumstance that's affecting them or their family or their neighborhood, that they get involved. And then all of a sudden, they've 10 years goes by and they've been involved. They founded a civil rights organization. Maybe they've met the president. Maybe they've delivered a speech on the National Mall. I mean, and all of a sudden they're somebody that we talk about, in our history classrooms and our writing classrooms, right? So, and I just think about Fannie Lou Hamer, or John Lewis, or Ella Baker, some of these really iconic folks from the movement who came from humble backgrounds, right? And who weren't necessarily looking to be leaders, but ended up becoming leaders, right? And so, and I try to make that point to students that that could be you, right? I mean, whatever they uh, seek to do as a profession, whether it's in politics or in policy or in communication, or they want to be an engineer or a scientist. Maybe you make some great breakthrough that you've been working on, and all of a sudden, you become some kind of household name that folks actually will remember. That's not always that's often not what people are striving for. They want to make a difference, make a living, but that any of us can actually rise to that level depending on the circumstances and what we pursue. So, and I feel like that's empowering, trying to to underscore that, yeah, you're not just being acted upon. I know that the moment that we live in feels that way in some ways, and it's sometimes I think it's there's um, uh, a decent amount of despair out there. I think about the direction of the country, um, and not everybody accepts what I offer, right? In terms of, that movements can really bring about change, even in a moment like today. In many ways, they're more important than ever, right? So that's how Jim Crow is defeated, by organizing for a long time, what was basically a fascist system inside the United States. And so that had, a lot of grasp on the federal government, although not exactly the way we see it now. But um, so I think empowering students to think that, yeah, they can make a difference, the movement work, but also, but pursuing their education and doing the work that they're doing and being able to write, read, think critically, analyze. Um, See what is helpful about AI, but what's not helpful about AI, right? And just be discerning can make a real difference in terms of changing society, right? Like all these people that we are talking about. Because it's not just about generals, it's not just about presidents, it's not just about Supreme Court justices. It's about regular folks. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's really great advice for your students to kind of help them kind of think about history in a way that's really relevant and present today. And kind of bouncing off of that, I was wondering if there were any topics or assignments that tend to really spark engagement from your students, especially when it comes to writing about justice and civic engagement.
Um, I'm still developing this course of so this new one. So I haven't really written the assignments yet for this new class. That's what my summer is going to be in many ways. Uh, I would say that I mean so a couple of my favorite assignments. Um, One, and I cited a lot. It's the first assignment that we did in my memorialization class, which was getting students to think about how we talk about these spaces and um, what visitors should expect and how they receive, like a memorial, like the Martin Luther King Memorial. The assignment is very short. It's asking students to write a National Park Service wayside, or an interpretive board. Just usually just the language. All this, toward the end, I also had them um, suggest images that they might want to use or other kinds of graphics, but I didn't have them build the whole thing because it was just an initial kind of assignment. But writing up to 150 words, how you would engage with the visitor, um, who are is coming to see the King Memorial and may not, may know something about him, but I think we presume too much about what people know. Um, and while yes, you can go on, to a QR code or online or something, pretend for the moment that the board is going to be the main way you're going to learn about this memorial and this person, and how would you go about doing that? And what it does is it gets students to think about how every word is freighted with meaning, right? No word is can be wasted if you only have 150 words to do it in. And I guess we have a sense of that already a little bit in terms of tweets and blue sky and like in social media has already has forced us to think that way a little bit, but thinking even more about precision and what's the essence of what you're trying to say, and how can you say it in a short way, but and keep people's attention and all that, but also just getting students to think about, well, do you just want to offer a biography of King, or do you really want to get them to think about um, the visitor's physical kind of interaction, and engagement with the space that they've just walked into, and maybe comment on, the controversies around the memorial. What does the memorial do and not do? Um, my next research project is about memorialization. Actually, after teaching about it for many years, I realized that I kind of wanted to spend time writing about it, and I thought I had some things to say about it. So that's one memorial, or I mean, one assignment. I think what I'm hoping to do for the fall, one of my sections, I think just one for the moment, will be a community engaged course where students will, hopefully, the idea is they'll do oral histories with people in the community that they can then use in their own research projects, right? So they're, in a sense, creating their own document, their own sources, or at least are a shared authority and participating in the creation of those sources, as a way to get to make better sense of whatever movement they might want to write about, eventually at the end of the semester. Um, the other assignment, and I don't, is it about civic engagement? In a way, maybe. When I was teaching the film class, I had a primary source assignment that I liked that was really a translation assignment, in terms of looking at 12 Years a Slave, the story of Solomon Northup, and his um, autobiography or the memoir that was the basis of the movie. And then read excerpts from the memoir and then watch the movie and then talk about, um, in a sense, does the movie do justice to the memoir, but also does it actually do some things better than the memoir does, if that makes sense, right? Like, does the film actually tell some parts of the story and the kind of degradation that slavery had on everybody involved, right? Because it really degraded everybody that it touched. Um, there's nothing benign or um, uh, good about slavery, despite what some politicians today might want to say. Um, and how does what does that allow us to say about film in general, as a productive way of understanding the past, right, and telling stories about the past, even if it doesn't get all the specific details absolutely correct. Um, those are kind of the assignments that I like the most. Whether or not they're all about civic engagement, I'm not sure, but they're the ones that I think that are asking students to do interesting things that I think get them to be thoughtful historians themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really love how a lot of those assignments work with kind of mixed media, looking at oral histories and kind of information boards or books and movies. I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
And I think what you mentioned about maybe doing more research into memorials and things of that nature is also really interesting. So I'm looking forward to maybe talking about that too later as
Sure.
that comes about. Yeah. And so I just have a few final questions, maybe some more quick fire personal reflections. I'm curious if there's one activist or movement or historical moment you wish more students were familiar with.
Wow, that's a really good that's a really good question. Um, I mean, in many ways, I wish. I mean, I guess a couple things. I would say one, I wish we just had a better, more nuanced sense of the larger freedom struggle and understanding that the larger freedom struggle was not just about um, lunch counters and voting rights, but it was also about um, economic justice and opportunity to get a good job and take care of your family, and also about just the pervasive state violence that African Americans and working class people in general um, faced, right? I alluded back to the youth gangs that worked together in Chicago in the late 60s and early 70s is because it was, working class white kids and working class Puerto Rican and Mexican American kids and working class black kids who were constantly being targeted by the police. And sometimes the treatment was a little bit different, and the African American kids are getting treated worse for sure. But they're all getting kind of bullied and picked on and harassed and jailed for no good reason. And then if you get any brush with the law, then it ends up sending you in a very different direction in your life, right? Whether or not you have a record or you're traumatized by being in jail or what have you. But I guess the other thing I was thinking about was um, the environmental justice movement is something that I guess that more students, when I first started teaching about social justice movements, most people did not really know that as a movement. They understood environmentalism, but they saw it as either conservation, like going back to, the beginning of the 20th century and the efforts to create national parks and and conserve land, but or to other efforts at environmentalism that emerged out of the 60s, like Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's work and that. Um, but I think that what we don't talk about enough is the pervasive placement of sewage treatment plants and landfills and those kinds of things in working class, usually predominantly black and brown neighborhoods. Um, and then the fights against those, right? Where there really has been that is also part of the civil rights struggle in many ways, is um, stop endangering our families and our neighborhoods by placing these kinds of things um, right next to them, and I would also say, and this is in some ways it's kind of all related, is the destruction of neighborhoods to build highways, which was very common in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And DC actually has actually one of the more um, hopeful moments, and that another sort of there was going to be an inner beltway. There's the outer beltway that exists now, but there's going to be an inner beltway that was going to destroy many DC neighborhoods, and uh, and it was fought both locally, multiracial kind of grassroots efforts with allies in Congress, and it was eventually defeated, and it's actually why we have the metro. Um, and so to me, that's one of those moments that I wish more people knew about, right? And that there were moments where highways were proposed that were going to go through and completely destroy a working class neighborhood, and then they were defeated for different reasons. And so I think those are really, I think that would be cool for folks to know about because I still, we see those moments all the time now. Not maybe not as crass as like building a highway through a neighborhood, but redeveloping, quote unquote blighted neighborhoods because of for whatever reason, so they can be redeveloped and then push poor people out, which of course we're seeing in DC throughout DC. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I definitely agree. I, of course, didn't know about the history of how the DC Metro came about. And as a huge fan of the metro system in DC, I think that's a really cool piece of history. So thank you so much for that. And maybe just to wrap this all up, um, especially on the issue of inequality and injustice, I'm wondering what advice, if any, you have for people who are maybe working today to resolve these issues of inequality and injustice, especially as your history touches on kind of the work that multiracial coalitions are doing and kind of the research about how people throughout history and time have persevered through these sort of persistent issues of inequality and injustice.
Mhm. I mean, I would reiterate some things I've said before, I guess, is like it's about building relationships and maintaining relationships. I think starting local, and I mean, rallies on the National Mall are great, and I participate in them, on a relatively regular basis because I'm here, and I feel like it's important to kind of signal that those are going on and people are showing up and they care about these issues in that way. Um, but it also wherever you are, whether in DC or some other part of the country or in the world, you know, um, working toward fighting inequality and injustice locally is really where the action is. And the national civil rights movement was in many ways just a bunch of local movements with some figures who kind of bridged the local and the national and were able to tends to Congress and to the House. Um, the Brown v. Board of Education decision was the result of a bunch of plaintiffs signing their name on a dotted line, knowing that that was going to lead to both economic and physical intimidation, that then becomes combined with other lawsuits that gets to the Supreme Court and overturns Jim Crow. And so it all starts locally, and saying that's not right, whether it's affecting you or it's affecting your neighbor or someone else, and starting from there. Because I think it can get really otherwise. Um, uh, it can get dispiriting when you look at Congress and what Congress is doing, or the Supreme Court, or the executive branch. I mean, so much change occurs locally and at the state levels, and then goes to the federal government. So while I think many folks are in DC for different reasons to be part of the kind of to operate in the federal government or on Capitol Hill or in nonprofits or in communication or what have you, it really does. And DC is a local place as well, right? So it's not like there isn't activism that needs to be done in DC about local DC issues. That's I think, an important thing that I'm going to try to get across to my students in the fall, starting in the fall, is how important activism is here that may not have anything to do with what's going on in the rest of the country, but it is a local DC fight because people lived here for generations that have nothing to do with the federal government. So people come and go, but lots of people are still here. So yeah, I would just say that start small, and it's about build you know building those relationships and maintaining them. And social media can play a role, but in the end, nothing changes. Nothing really replaces sitting next to somebody or across from somebody and talking with them in person.
So
Yeah,
again, so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
absolutely. It was a pleasure.